Hi, I'm Charlie. Um, I just wanted to start, given that this is about COP26 over, where do we go from here? I want to just say that I've intentionally not been really dug into the granular detail of the negotiations because I know from experience that that's really, really bad for my mental health. The first COP that I went to, which was in Copenhagen, uh, I was there as a delegate, and when it ended, kind of famously and catastrophically and essentially nothing, I had I had a breakdown. And the years after that and before, I really kind of obsessively dedicated my life to fighting climate change. And it took a few more years for me to have a dramatic enough breakdown to go to a psychiatric hospital and be diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Um, and the years since then, I've been working and then episodically having to stop because of depression. Um, and that kind of back and forth went on for quite a long time until a few years ago I had a suicide attempt where I jumped off a building and spent a month in a coma and lost a leg. Um, and one of the big things that I've noticed since then, um, other than the fact that I don't have a right leg anymore, is that before my attempt, there was a real pressure on me to think about mental illness in a very individualized way and an atomized way. So I was made to think about it through my treatment as either being a largely genetic thing or uh, to do with personal behavior choices or uh, a glitch in my neurochemistry that had to be fixed. And since my attempt, I've come to understand mental illness through treatment, through research, through talking to clinicians, through speaking to other sufferers. That actually the modern science, the kind of cutting edge stuff, is much more about a social model of illness. So mental illness being largely about how people are embedded in the world, how we see ourselves as fitting into our environment. And I've I've realised that and been told that climate change was a huge driver of the reality of climate change in and of itself was a huge driver of the precipitation of my illness and also the struggles that I've had since. And I know that a lot of people have been thinking about this. There's been a lot of discussion about mental health and climate change, but the terminology that's being used is just completely wrong. So eco-anxiety seems to be the most popular term, and the Oxford English Dictionary introduced it into their lexicon in the run-up to COP, and while it might sound like a good thing, they chose to define it as unease or apprehension related to ecological devastation. And not only is that inaccurate, it's also euphemistic and offensive to people who have been sometimes crippled with lifelong conditions as a result of climate change. And I'm talking about depression, anxiety, PTSD, psychosis, substance use disorders, the list goes on and on, eating disorders, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar. And I've been writing a column for the Ecologist about all of this, and I'm working on a book. And the term I've landed on is climate disorder, because I feel like that, as an umbrella term, I'm not a clinician, but as an umbrella term, I feel like that encapsulates the way that the disordered climate is disordering our minds. And there are two elements of that I'd like to outline briefly today. So one is despair, climate despair, and that comes from thinking about climate change and that having material impacts on our thoughts. And 45% of people around the world, young people around the world, have said that thinking about climate change is directly hampering their daily lives. I did my own survey, and it was on Twitter, so it wasn't a scientific study, but almost 2,000 people replied, and 79% said that climate change had moderately or severely impacted their mental health. And there are lots of cases that have been documented around the world, but I only have time really to go to explain one, which is the first diagnosis of climate psychosis was a young man in Australia who refused to drink water and was, there was a life-threatening condition. He was refusing to drink water because he was convinced that millions of people would die if he did. And therapists have been saying, there was an article last week that came out saying that therapists feel that they're not equipped to deal with the ailments that are arising as a result of climate change. The second part that I want to talk about is climate trauma, and that's mental illness that comes from the direct experience of the physical impact of climate change. So the first bit I want to talk about is natural disasters, and knitting together a few different studies. Flooding and storms can increase the risk of depression by 50%. Wildfires can increase the severity of symptoms for PTSD, anxiety, and major depressive disorder by between 50 and 75%. Heat, so just a hotter day, heat waves, have been systematically linked to increased suicide risk. And already 60,000 people in India have died by suicide as a result of climate change. Conflict is also set to get far worse as a result of climate change. So for every half degree rise we might see 10 to 20% increase in armed conflict, which could result in hundreds of millions of climate refugees. And we know that asylum seekers and refugees are 5 times more likely to need mental health support and also be the least likely to get it. Key thing that I want to say is that these phenomena need to be distinctly recognized, and we need to come up with solutions for them and answers for them, for the dealing with the symptoms, but also making sure that they don't happen in the first place. And what I can share from my personal experience is that the individual and the social lens, when it comes to understanding what causes mental illness, also applies to cures. And I've only been able to get well and stay well since my accident because I became an active participant in my recovery with a resilient web of relationships. So it's a much more relational model. It's a social model of recovery. And those relationships don't just extend to my therapist or my family or my friends, or I've also been extending them out into my community and reconnecting with nature, all of which scientific studies show can be really, really helpful in helping avoid the onset of mental illness, but also kind of keeping people healthy. And the extra element of it is that I've been re-engaging in the issues and movements, again as an active participant in issues that I really care about that can solve both climate change and mental health. And a lot of these ideas the RSA is championing, so I'm quite proud to be on this stage, including a kind of climate-related universal basic income, more direct democracy, a shorter working week, an inclusive Green New Deal, rewilding, different models of care. And what stitches these together is including people as equals and respecting nature. Last night I was at a talk where somebody said that he thought that there were 2 COPs going on in Glasgow at the moment. One was the delegates and the negotiations, and the other was the web of relationships that was being built outside of them. And I heard somebody ask Crip afterwards that was there's a good cop, bad cop dynamic, and I'm inclined to agree. And the good cop, the kind of relationship building, the networks, has given me a real sense of active hope. And I know that building resilient alternatives and relationships, regardless of what those in power do, can help. And in that spirit, if anybody wants to reach out and get in touch with me and share their experiences or discuss alternatives, then please do. Thank you.